chemical, if you like, is more, or mixtures of chemicals in various concentrations and in various designs, is more important than what it's made of, then you call it an article. So you've got a little sort of USB type connector there, and a rather sophisticated article there in a fighter jet of some sort. So articles are not to be confused, by the way, with articles in legislation, because you can have Article 1, Article 2, and so on. But this is a particular form of article, meaning something which has a particular shape and function, which is more important than what it's made out of. And these are the principal obligations. Registration of chemicals, if you're an importer or manufacturer of chemicals in the EU, above 1 ton per annum. If chemicals are manufactured or used in the EU, then there's a requirement to only use chemicals if you're authorized to do so. If they are, certain chemicals are restricted from use under certain circumstances. There's also substance restrictions, which is different from the item above. That means that a chemical is not allowed to be used according to a specific list in the back of the REACH regulation. That's known as Annex 17, the one to do with chemicals which may only be used under certain circumstances within the EU, where authorised is Annex 14. Annex 17 used to be the Marketing and Use Directive in the EU, and that was kind of subsumed into REACH along with 39 other regulations or directives back in 2007. And the fourth obligation is to provide information on chemicals that you supply or products, if the product information as well. Sometimes you have to provide information on hazardous substances in an article with a capital A, and also information on safe use. And I will dig a little bit into that later on. So that in one slide is the obligations of REACH, and it's only skimming over the surface. The impacts on industry have really been twofold. Firstly, massive increase in supply chain communication. Most of you in your businesses will already have been having to do that because of other requirements, RoHS or ROS type requirements in the EU, or maybe California, for example, or providing products into China. You would already be asking information about hazardous chemicals, and now with REACH, it's much wider, as we will see. And the second issue is obsolescence. There's a gradual increase and quite a strong increase in the number of chemicals which have increasing obligations associated with them arising out of REACH, and this has an effect on how those chemicals are perceived by manufacturers and suppliers and customers. And it has the general effect of pushing chemicals off the market where they are sort of under scrutiny, even if not necessarily restricted or banned, as you might call it. And that is a major issue. And I shall touch on some chemicals which are particularly sort of important later on. Now, in the build-up to looking at who is going to be coming to this webinar today, I noticed, or we noticed with Turi, that some people on the call are supplying into the military or defence market. So I just wanted to touch on that briefly. The first thing to say is that under REACH, there is no, what I call here, blanket exclusion for military applications. This is a really important thing to grasp. Certainly in the EU, there are so many pieces of legislation where military or national security type applications are out of scope, ROS being one example, WE directive on waste disposal of electronics being another, where applications of that nature are out of scope. But this is not the case with respect to REACH. And this comes quite hard, I think, to some companies who are used to supplying to that market, because they generally speaking look to the procurement specifications of their customer, like the Ministry of Defence in the UK, Department of Defence in the US. And but that, in fact, that isn't the only show in town as far as compliance requirements are in the EU nowadays, because REACH doesn't consider that specifically. However, REACH does allow member states to exclude certain chemicals from from scope under certain circumstances. But this is a right that member states have exercised, in some cases not at all. In the UK's case, they have set up a, if you like, a REACH light system, which allows chemicals to be treated in a confidential way, maybe under some ITAR application, for example, without it becoming public domain information. But it's only exercised very seldom, and it should not be assumed that just because one's supplying military equipment, somehow a special case is going to be made, particularly when it's clear that alternatives do exist. The last point I'd like to make about that is that there's no mutual recognition agreement between the member states. So say, for example, the UK decided that it was going to allow the use of a chemical in a particular application. That doesn't necessarily mean that other member states would necessarily put that in place. So if you're making a sort of a platform which is one part's being built in the UK, for example, and then being shipped to Italy next, for example, and there's no automatic case that there won't be a problem from the REACH perspective once you import into Italy. So this is just an important thing to realise. There's no military exemption as such. It's important to realise that what the implications of obsolescence are here is that unlike ROS, where in general there are where exemptions exist, one can carry on exercising that exemption for products placed on the market before the deadline when a product was placed on the market. But one can carry on repairing it, even if, for example, it didn't have to be ROS compliant before. You can carry on repairing it with non-ROS compliant parts if it was out of scope when it was first placed on the market. But this sort of consideration is not considered at all within REACH. So you could, for example, find yourself with a product which is on the market and you want to carry on maintaining it, but the parts that you want to replace it with, you may no longer be allowed to use a certain restricted substance because that is no longer allowed. And if you look at the list of restrictions in Annex 17, you'll see that there is in general, no allowance to continue using that substance, even if the product you're trying to maintain is already on the market. And the second point about obsolescence I'd mention is that even if a chemical isn't necessarily banned yet, or if it's on a sort of list which is on its way to being restricted in some way, or even just reported on, then there's pressure to phase it out. Often it's the thin end of the wedge. And it's also worth bearing in mind that even if you only, say, for example, place a product on the market outside of the EU, that doesn't necessarily mean that the chemical is going to continue to be available, because it's the world now which is the supply chain and the market, and most manufacturers will try to keep their products uniform and in the same way that we've seen with lead solder in ROS. Companies don't want to maintain a lead-free and a leaded product if at all possible, and sometimes it'll be difficult for them to get hold of the parts anyway. So phase-out pressure is always there, I would say, and is probably the main technical issue and commercial issue that arises out of REACH. So let's talk a little bit about latest developments. Before kind of plunging into this, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the process, about how a chemical ends up being regulated in some way. Now, for those of you who follow REACH closely, you'll be aware that the European Chemicals Agency, who are the body responsible for REACH within the EU, in Helsinki, in Finland, they maintain a very full and extensive website all about REACH, and one of the pages is a list of what they call of intentions to take chemicals forward, a registry of intentions they call it. And you can easily follow that yourself if you wish. And it tells you what chemicals have been nominated by the European Commission or member states to go forward to extra measures. After a chemical is placed on the registry of intentions, it may be formally proposed for further measures. And out of that, it may be, if it meets the criteria, be classified as a substance of very high concern. A substance of very high concern, or SVHC, is a chemical which meets a particular list of criteria, which things like which are carcinogenic, mutagenic, toxic to reproduction, persistent, bioaccumulative and toxic, very persistent, very bioaccumulative, endocrine disruptors, and other chemicals of similar concern. And this is quite an extensive list of chemicals. Well, I think we're talking of the order of 2,000 or 3,000. And it's the intention of REACH that all chemicals that meet those criteria will eventually be placed, will be classified as SVHCs, placed on something called the candidate list, which again you can look at on the ECHO website, and subsequently taken forward for what's called authorization. I only have space for the first 3 letters here. And so this process is already underway. Authorization means that a chemical can only be manufactured or used in the EU if specific authorization has been applied for and granted by a particular company. The alternative route, I'll get to in a minute. So just stepping back a bit, before the registry of intentions, is there any visibility of what chemicals may end up on the registry of intentions? Once chemicals are on the registry of intentions, the process is quite quick. From there onwards until a chemical is made an SVHC or placed on Annex 14, which means it's subject to authorization. But there is visibility earlier in the process. In particular, there's something called the CORAP list, which is developed and maintained by ECHA. And very recently, they published a roadmap on how they intend to take substances of very high concern forward, and I'll say a little bit about that in a few slides' time, because that's quite a recent development. So it's not as if once a chemical appears on the registry of intentions, that's the first time it has ever been sort of considered as being, or if you like, in the public domain, as being worthy of consideration for further measures. One can look further if one's minded to do so. Just looking at that process alongside legal obligations, it's worth bearing in mind that up until a chemical is actually a substance of very high concern, there is no legal obligations at all as far as REACH is concerned, but it doesn't mean that other pressures may not exist, because as soon as a chemical is proposed, in most cases, with the odd exception, chemicals do carry on down the process to become substances of very high concern. Therefore, it's much easier from a manufacturer's perspective to try and eradicate that chemical from their product, if at all possible. And given that, yes, I'll say something else in a moment. Once it is a substance of very high concern, then there is the legal obligation to provide data on that substance of very high concern if it's in an article above 0.1% by weight of the article, and also to notify ECHA if it's used above a certain tonnage per annum as well. But in general, that isn't an obligation that most people have to follow, so which is why I'm not going to go into detail now. However, that's not a ban on use of chemicals, it's just a requirement to provide information. However, when a chemical is authorized, it means it's only allowed to be used for the uses for which it's been authorized by the applicant and their supply chain. And that is a very specific restriction. Now, an alternative rather than authorization, which applies to chemicals and but doesn't apply to a chemical once it's inside an article or part of an article, I don't, by inside, I don't mean like a chemical inside a can. I'm talking about like or an aerosol, for example. I mean a chemical which is part of, for example, the enclosure of the computer you're looking at the moment. That enclosure is made out of chemicals, but once it's made into an enclosure, authorization doesn't apply, which means that for companies importing into the EU, authorization isn't an issue insofar as they're using those chemicals outside of the EU. The alternative route from authorization is restriction, and there's an extensive list in Annex 17 of over 60 chemicals now, and against each of those chemicals there's very specific guidance on what that restriction means. Sometimes it's a total ban in all uses, sometimes it's a ban at certain concentration in specific uses, and there are a number of variations. It's not like the Ross Directive where it's always for a particular element. It's for a particular it's at a particular concentration. It's very, very diverse. So you need to look, and there are many restrictions in there which have been around for a long time, like the restriction on cadmium in most uses, apart from high reliability applications, has been around since I think it's 1991. There are many chemicals in there, asbestos and so on. The last thing I wanted to mention is lobby lists. There are a lot of people out there who have views on what chemicals are hazardous and should be regulated in some way, and I'm putting those all into this cloud of lobby lists, and it's always worth keeping an eye on those, because some of those chemicals will go forward to be regulated in some way, because the regulators agree with the lobbyists. In some cases they won't agree, and the chemicals won't go forward. And there have been a few occasions of chemicals which have been proposed by member states, which have been withdrawn or have been diverted along other routes. It's not an inevitable process, and REACH has the merit, compared with Ross, for example, that it is much more science-based in the way that it actually assesses chemicals. However, the fact that a chemical is on a lobby list, it tends to act as a deterrent against its use. So what are SVHCs, substances of very high concern? Well, currently there are 151 of them. In October 2008 we had the first, I think it was 15, and 13 were added last year. These were added just before Christmas, 16th of December. And I've just kind of put on this slide some examples of where these chemicals are used. So you can see cadmium-based pigments are great in terms of providing a very permanent bright yellow, and also cadmium sulfide can be used in photoelectronics as well. Those two the plasticizers, there are many plasticizers are covered by REACH nowadays. Many SVHCs, I think we're possibly up to 6 or 7 phthalates are now classed as SVHCs. There's one there. A couple more pigments mentioned there too are also SVHCs. Ethylene thiourea, because it's a vulcanization agent, unless the vulcanization process hasn't been done correctly, it shouldn't be present in the final product. But lead diacetate would be present in the final product. And you can see there's a number of applications there in various sort of paints related and fillers and so on. TXP, quite a few flame retardants are on the SVHC list nowadays as well, and here's the latest one. It's also used as a flame retardant in hydraulic fluid as well. So you can see just from that example, that snapshot of out of the 151, that quite a few SVHCs are used and are present in final product. By product I mean things like hardware, electronics, hydroelectrical, mechanical type products, and I suspect most of the people on this call are in the market of providing hardware, components, assemblies, sub-assemblies, final product, and you can see that quite a few of them will, in certain circumstances, contain SVHCs. Of course, in many applications, they won't be there, but it is possible, and one has to assess that, and that's an issue. So as I mentioned, there are 151 SVHCs, and here's a little map of how SVHCs have grown since 2008. The European Chemicals Agency have set themselves a target of 578 SVHCs identified by 2020, and you can see here the graph of how they're doing. They had a massive step up in during 2012 to meet the target of 136, which they surpassed by 2, as you can see there. And the process goes on. There's a bit of a lag there, I'll say, between 2014 and 2015. There was quite a slowdown last year after the big jump, and I think member states and the ECHA may be finding it difficult to find the resources to actually process so many chemicals. Excuse me. Now, one of the criticisms of industry in general has been the lack of visibility of what SVHCs are likely to be identified and put on this thing called a candidate list. Some companies have even said, well, can't you just provide us with a list of all of them, and then at least we'll know, rather than having this drip, drip, drip of chemicals, and we forever having to go back to our suppliers to say, do you use this? Do you supply components to me which contain this SVHC? ECHA has responded to this with what is called the roadmap to deal with this evolution of the candidate list of SVHCs. And they published the roadmap on the 9th of December. There's the front cover. And the roadmap comprises a description of the process that ECHA intend to roll out for defining what SVHCs need to be taken forward to further measures. And it comprises these 2 steps, screening and risk management option analysis. Screening they describe as an informal assessment whether a substance meets the criteria to be classed as an SVHC. And they say that they'll give priority to what they call core activities, which means screening substances which are already registered substances, but excluding intermediates. That intermediates being chemicals which are used in the course of chemical production in general, but aren't out more widely on the market. So they tend to concentrate on these core substances, but they also intend to carry out what they call supplementary activities to identify substances with similar properties to identified SVHCs. So that means SVHCs which are already on the candidate list, or ones which are in process of going onto the candidate list, or those which haven't quite got that far. And the reason for this is that what they want to try and avoid is the situation where one substance is, for example, slated for being subject to authorization, and therefore industry looks for alternatives, and they just swap to another substance which is actually of equivalent concern. And you can see this in the way that they've actually managed the process to now, because, for example, with chromating solutions for producing anti-corrosion finishes, they actually held up for putting those chemicals onto Annex 14, the chemical substances subject to authorization, until a number of them had got up to that point, and then they put them all on together such that the alternatives were also on Annex 14 together. So that stopped industry from, if you like, doing things which didn't make any sense, moving from one chemical with hazards to another chemical with similar hazards. Now, what ECHA hasn't got in place yet, but they foresee needs to be in place, is selection criteria for prioritizing what chemicals go forward. And these could be, for example, based on the volume of chemical or its potential for exposure. it would have been nice if these criteria had been available earlier, because we've certainly seen with the ROS directive that with consideration of additional substances there, for example, that the fact that this prioritization criteria hasn't really been defined before has been a real source of contention in that project. But even so, even if they define criteria, they foresee quite reasonably that there will be gaps in data. Many chemicals, it's just not known what their properties are, certainly to equivalent levels, and some chemicals are very well scrutinized, but their alternatives aren't necessarily, and that's going to inhibit things. As far as risk management options are concerned, the purpose of that is to clarify whether risk management activities are required and to identify the most appropriate instrument for doing that. So if that was under REACH, it would be maybe a restriction, for example, to stop it being used in articles. That would be a good way of doing that. Or they might decide that the major issue is associated with manufacturing and using the chemical itself, in which case they would choose the you can only use it if it's authorized route. Or they might decide there's another route entirely, like, for example, defining it as a persistent organic pollutant, in which case it would be banned that way if they can get the cooperation of other legislative areas around the world, because that would be a global ban. They might even decide that no action is required currently. One would hope that if that was likely to be the case, then their prioritization process earlier on would have identified it as a low priority, and it wouldn't have got that far. But I don't know about whether that would be the case. Now, the thing I'd like to mention about this particularly is how we're going to hear about it out in the outside world, outside of member states, outside of the Commission, outside of ECHA. They say they're going to publish annual reports, and the first will be March of next year. But it's not going to contain an awful lot of detail apart from the progress they're making and what metrics they're going to use. But they do say they're going to come up with this thing called the Activities Coordination Tool, or a public version of this, which they're calling PACT. They already use a thing called ACT, which is an information sort of tool used by member states, ECHA, European Commission, and they're going to provide a public front end to that, or a public view into that. But this is only a view into the data. It's not a form of consultation, and I think that's really important to realize that, because there are places in the existing process where industry can make its views known, like, for example, when a substance is classed as an SVHC, or when it's put forward to be put on Annex 14. But that is all rather late in the day. By the time a chemical is at that point, it's pretty clear that something's going to happen to it. And at the moment, it doesn't seem clear that there's going to be much opportunity for input earlier in the process. Like, for example, pointing out that a chemical actually is not used in a volume application anymore and hasn't been for years. And all of industry know that, but the policymakers don't. And therefore, they go forward with a measure, whereas, in fact, it's only ever used in niche applications nowadays, and therefore the need for some sort of regulation of that substance might be much less than has been identified. And that would be very useful information to know, because it would mean less of a burden for industry, and it would mean that the policy regulators can actually divert their resources towards more serious issues. So I would encourage you that if any of you are part of trade bodies, or that you talk to your trade association about how you intend to input into that process, and to actually make your views known about how you would like to be involved in that process. Read the document I've got on the screen there. Okay, enough of that. Authorization I've already touched on. If a substance of very high concern is placed on Annex 14, it's not allowed on the EU market as a chemical or manufactured after what's called a sunset date, unless the use is authorized. And this affects directly producers and importers of chemicals, because they cannot do so. It affects the downstream user of chemicals, because they can't use the chemical if they're not authorized to do so by, for example, their supplier, or they haven't got the authorization themselves. and it might affect the producer of an article in the EU if they can't use that chemical to make their article. It indirectly affects the world market, as I said before. The last bullet point first, which I think I've mentioned, authorization is not required by importers and users of articles that contain these substances as integral parts which are made outside the EU. So if you make it outside the EU, import it as an article, authorization is not relevant to you. Worth bearing in mind that use is a quite broad term, includes storage, transfer between containers, processes, and disposal. The reason that they are included is because they are all, you can be exposed to the chemical at any of those stages. Authorization. Here's a list of SVHCs that have recently got onto Annex 14. There are 22 so far, as I say here, so it's massively behind the candidate list, which is 151, as I said. And we've got a couple of phthalate plasticizers there, bis-2-ethyl hexyl phthalate, DEHP, and dibutyl phthalate, DBP. Also a flame retardant, HBCDD, MDA using epoxies. The chromating solutions I've mentioned already, that's one of the most major issues for industry over in the EU. Actually getting parts treated with hexachrome finishes over in the EU, even if you're allowed to do it, because the product you're making isn't regulated. It's very difficult. Obviously, if you're making a ROS product, you can't use it anyway because hexachrome is banned by ROS. But for other applications which aren't electrical or electronic, you still have an issue nowadays because a lot of chromating baths are now trivalent or alternatives. So it's a problem. Sodium dichromate, which is also used for the same application, but also used for hard chromium plating, that's on the list. Trichloroethylene, massively useful decreasing agent, that's on the list as well. And you can see on the right there the sunset dates. But it shouldn't be assumed that just because of a sunset date, for example for the chromates back out in September 2017, it means that people will be able to carry on using those chemicals till then, because if there's no commercial demand for it, or a company who does that see that they need to sort of change their processes, then they may well do that. And the first thing you'll know if you have a manufacturing facility in the EU is you can't actually get your parts places in the EU. So in fact, this is actually something which is anti-competitive in the sense that it actually damages EU industry in respect of the rest of the world. So it's a strangely thought out requirement.
Okay. Chris, I think I'm going to ask if we can just interrupt you here briefly so that we can launch our quiz. Again, this is for our TUR planners in order for them to get credit for their continuing education. This is, as I say, a very brief quiz just for them. It's, of course, not necessary for all of the rest of you, but of course you're welcome to take it if you would like. And let me suggest, though, that for the rest of you who don't need to take this quiz, if you'd like to come up with a question for Chris in our question period, now would be a good time for you to come up with how you'd like to word that. And again, send it to us via the chat function at the bottom of your control panel. We do have a couple of questions that we will pose to Chris. So, quiz takers, this will be just about a minute, and then we'll cut it off. So if this were network television, we would have a spirited bit of music here to play with you, for you, but we don't.
I'm not going to sing.
Nor will I, Chris. And let's give it 10 more seconds. Five more seconds. Okay, we'll stop the quiz now, and thank you. And Chris, go on ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I didn't see those the poll on the screen, so I assume other people did, but maybe it's because I've got my screen configured wrongly. Okay. Yeah, the last thing I just wanted to mention on this slide was that it's not inevitable that once a chemical is being put forward for authorization that it necessarily will end up that way, because, for example, the last item on this list, cobalt compounds, was originally put forward for Annex 14, but in fact it's now proposed that it will be restricted instead, which makes more sense in the sense that it has more of an effect in terms of driving out the hazardous cobalt compounds from the market to actually stop it being used in the final product. So there is just a snapshot on substances subject to authorization. I'd just like to mention a little bit about DHP and DBP because I've been using this word authorization throughout. You can apply for authorization to carry on using these chemicals, and you maybe have it granted. And oh yeah, sorry. Before I do that, I had one extra point I hadn't I'd forgotten about. I just wanted to mention refractory ceramic fibers. These are a bit like glass fiber insulation, a very fibrous material, but have particularly useful properties for producing good thermal insulation, but which has a low thermal mass for things like round furnaces, but particularly in things like planes because it's light, but provides the thermal insulation you need. But these are proposed for authorization, and it's not clear that if they are taken forward to be placed on Annex 14, what the substitutes are going to be, because it seems almost inevitable that substitutes are going to have a similar structure and therefore the same sort of issues that asbestos does, for example, or these do, because they're all fibrous. So you know, there can be big issues associated with authorization in particular applications. This is just one example. Yeah. So I wanted to mention DHP and DBP. Rolls-Royce were the first brave company to go forward with a request for authorization for continued use of a substance placed on Annex 14, which would therefore not be allowed to be used after, in this case, February 2015. They put forward a case for DHP. Their application was very specialist. It was for using in brazing turbine blades onto the sort of central hub or boss of turbines, and they needed this substance, they said, to enable them to do that brazing successfully, producing a sort of an area within which the brazing would happen, using very, very small amounts of the chemical in a very specialized, controlled way. And they made an application, and their application has been successful insofar as they've received a favorable view from the Risk Assessment Committee and the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee, two committees which are operated by ECHA, which means that, assuming that there's no other impediments are placed in the way, that authorization should be allowed. However, they've had to do a lot of work to put together a technical dossier to substantiate the reason for it, and it's been expensive in terms of application fee as well. So it's not the sort of thing that most companies will do. However, so there have been further applications of both of these chemicals. There's been applications for about 16 different applications from 6 companies for these two chemicals. For DHP, formulation of polymer feedstocks. That's for use in PVC and also for manufacture of various sensors and as rocket propellants. DBP, some other specialized applications as well. We don't know what's going to happen, how this is going to go forward. The applications for sensors and rocket propellants and various for DHP and the various applications for DBP are quite specialized and presumably quite low volume. It seems possible that the case is quite strong for those. I obviously haven't seen the dossier. For DHP in PVC, that may be much more difficult because you're talking about quite large volume uses. PVC is used in many places, as we all know. And whether it's actually a robust case and that alternatives have been properly investigated it's difficult to know without having seen the dossiers. So we will watch this space, and it will be useful information for others who wish to go forward along this process. So I've really come to almost the end. Just a few concluding thoughts. We're in a process which is ongoing. REACH started in terms of being effective from 2007, and it's gradually rolls out now, more chemicals being affected in different ways, the process gradually becoming more mature. And but it doesn't just affect the EU, it does affect the global market, and I'm sure some of you on the call will have experienced issues associated with ongoing use of chemicals. Maybe you're trying to substitute already, or maybe your customer is encouraging you along that way. Maybe you can't get hold of a chemical anymore because of REACH, or maybe also other requirements globally. And we consider what I call engagement is crucial by industry. It is often the case that industry doesn't find out about these requirements until it's too late for them to have an input to the process. But it is possible under many pieces of legislation, including REACH, to have some input to the process. But regulation is a bit like a super tanker. By the time you've almost hit the rocks, it's far too late to do anything about it. But if you can see the rocks in the distance, and a small tweak on the tiller can make a big difference, and that has been the case with other pieces of regulation. And with REACH, it's true that if you can be engaged early on, then you can actually have an effect on the process, which can be very useful. And the obsolescence I've mentioned isn't going to go away; it's going to grow as the number of chemicals get regulated in some way. We've already seen over the last few years of quite a lot of trickle down from the EU, but also out of US legislation. Sometimes it happens in the opposite direction with things like conflict minerals, that copycat or very similar requirements grow in other jurisdictions, where even if there is no legal requirement, other markets just tend to follow because it's a global market. So we would suggest working with others where possible. This tends to be an area where working together helps, which is why trade associations are such useful things, and organisations like TURI, who seek to look for alternatives in a constructive way, are so valuable. And keep up to date. It's very important and much easier to deal with issues if you know about them early on, and then you can fit that into your normal processes, design products which will meet future requirements and not just current requirements, and that's going to be lower cost in the long run. So I hope that's been useful. That's all I have to say about REACH. Quite enough for one day, I'm sure. And if you've got any questions, then I'd be very pleased to answer them. Back to you, Mark.
Yes, we do have a few questions, Chris. The first one that came in during the time you were showing that inverted triangle slide, the overall process, from starting with the candidate list and concluding with authorization. Yes, this is the one, and the question is, what is the timeline here? Can you talk about how long this process takes?
Oh, it's interesting that. Let me just. We maintain a sort of database of kind of tracking this process. I was just going to put it up and have a quick look at it, because we kind of monitor it. Just bear with me a second. Right. He's just thinking a little bit, and then I'll have an answer for you. Okay. Thank you. So I'm just having a little look. So, the timeline between a substance getting on the registry of intention, being proposed by that route, and becoming an SVHC is typically about 5 months, and then the time period between let's see now, the time period between going on the registry of intentions and actually being Yeah, that's right. That's what I was looking for. So it's about 5 months between going on registry of intentions and actually becoming an SVHC, which is why if you want to sort of say something about whether that's a valid thing to do, you really need to have your information available, because there is a public consultation at that point, but it's kind of there and gone within a few months, and you need, if you're going to make a case, you really need to have your ducks in a row beforehand. And then once the substance is on Annex 14, then typically the sunset period is of the order of maybe 3-4 years thereafter.
Okay, another question. Our questioner noted that the EU recently backed off a bit on greenhouse gas emission requirements. Wondering if, from what you have seen and from your experience, if there might be any chance that any of the REACH requirements might be reduced, in particular with regard to expense.
Expense from what perspective? Was that not specified?
Wasn't specified, unfortunately.
Okay. Okay. There has been some movement in terms of reducing expense for small to medium-sized enterprise in terms of things like registration fees, and that was already actually built into the regulation at kickoff. And there has been some guidance and support provided to smaller organisations and things like workshops and specific guidance. I personally don't see them making moves to slacken off, except if member states decide that they does not allocate the budgets, and therefore the manpower, person power needed to, for example, take us forward SVHCs with the speed that they kind of have agreed with the European Commission. This kind of graph I put up here. That will only happen if they continue sort of putting in the manpower to do it, and we don't have visibility of whether they'll do that or not. But I personally don't really see they're going to take the foot off the pedal. The fact that things are very, very slow getting onto Annex 14, substances getting onto Annex 14, there doesn't seem to be any sign that it's going to be accelerated or indeed decelerated.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we could go on for quite some time, but we are out of time. So I would like to thank all of you who participated today. We had a very robust turnout, and we're very, very pleased by that. You will be receiving in about an hour, I believe, an evaluation of this event. It's very brief, but very important for us. We really do scrutinize these responses very carefully, and they are a great help to us in planning future events. So if you would please take just a few minutes of time to fill that out, we would be very, very appreciative. The slides from this presentation will be available, and we will make them available on the TORI website. So I would like to thank our presenter, Chris. Thank you very much for joining. It's been a very, very useful hour here with you. And I would also like to thank Maria Scholl, who has been running the software here at the TORI offices. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and this is the end of our webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.